So why don't we bring on our guest, and that's, of course, Seth Ackerman, who's going to talk to us a little bit about why Joe Biden's infrastructure proposal is not the New Deal, despite all of the exaggerated language we've heard from some Democrats. Seth, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start off with why it is that Biden's proposal is nowhere near what we saw with the New Deal.
Well, I think that the biggest distinction between what Biden is doing and what Roosevelt was doing, or between their approaches, and I think this is probably the most telling aspect of the situation, is what you're hearing or not hearing from business, from the Chamber of Commerce, from the National Association of Manufacturers, or the business world generally. The Republicans, of course, are screaming about this bill and calling it all kinds of names. That's their job. But their business allies are, for one thing, it's important to remember that unlike most of the programs of the New Deal that we remember today, an infrastructure plan more or less along the lines that Biden is proposing has been at the top of the wish list of the Chamber of Commerce. I mean, also of the labor movement too. It's an area of very wide consensus in American politics among American interest groups, and so what you have is a situation where Biden is finally taking the opportunity of the kind of void left by the destruction in Trump's wake politically, to be able to push through something that was always considered to be a kind of political low-hanging fruit, because everybody was for infrastructure, nobody was against infrastructure, and it was just a kind of it was political dysfunction that was keeping it from happening. So this is something that business wanted. That doesn't necessarily make it, reactionary, because it also has a lot of things in it that are going to be good for workers, but it all depends on the details, which we don't have yet. Everything that I just said, differs pretty markedly from Roosevelt, who famously, number one, was detested by the National Association of Manufacturers at the time, and he famously said that he welcomed their hatred. That's not at all Biden's approach. Biden, the other day, he said, this isn't socialism. I believe in American capitalism. And, I think that it's important to sort of keep a balanced perspective. On the one hand, this is, I think, a much more aggressive approach to, kind of traditional liberal policy than we saw from Obama. And then at the same time, it's not like the New Deal, because of the nature of who's lining up for and against it. Biden is really pushing through the measures that have really some of the broadest support of anything that you could find on the Democratic policy agenda.
Yeah, it's, people don't realize, or people don't remember, or it's just not really talked about that much, but the reaction to Roosevelt, I mean, there was something called the business plot, like a literal coup attempt from several business leaders and some members of the military to remove Roosevelt through a military coup and install some sort of fascist government, and it was foibled. You wrote in a Substack piece that I found very provocative and good, where that while a lot of liberals are comparing Biden to FDR and LBJ, and apparently Biden likes that comparison, that the closest historical parallel to the Biden-Schumer-Pelosi plan is the Trump-McConnell-Pelosi COVID package of 2022, also known as the CARES package, that Biden, the man he should compare himself to, is not FDR or LBJ, but rather one Donald J. Trump. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, well, it's very easy to forget now. Among other things, it's easy to forget anything that happened 6 months ago, because there's been such a fire hose of news over the last few years. But just a year ago, something happened which probably would have been hard for anybody to believe if they'd been told about it, a few years previously, which was that a Republican president signed into law a bill that sent out checks for free to every household, whether they were working or not, plus a lot of other stuff that probably would have been hard to believe a Republican would be supporting. And obviously that was because of an emergency situation. The pandemic was something that was different from anything that we'd experienced before. And but the fact that in that emergency situation, political consensus existed to push through a policy like that, it really, I think, broke down a lot of barriers and taboos that have allowed Biden to kind of push what ultimately is in the end a very similar kind of policy. It's kind of like the CARES Act, only more so. You see a lot of, in fact, you see a lot of continuity in the sense that Trump was politically incapable of actually doing it, but if there was one real actual policy as opposed to just Twitter theatrics that Trump always was promising that he wanted to do and that he was going to do, but he never did, was infrastructure. And then the one thing that he ended up doing as a big policy measure, other than his tax bill, was a big emergency cash assistance plan. And what you're seeing initially from the Biden administration is a big infrastructure bill and a big cash assistance emergency program. So in that sense, it's continuity. But on the other hand, there is this change in the atmosphere, a change in the set of things that Democratic senators seem to be willing to swallow, that the Democratic policy world seems willing to entertain. And I think it's good to be skeptical of how much those noises are actually going to be realized. But my sense is that something has changed. It's just not clear exactly what it is yet. What it isn't is another New Deal.
Right. And one of the things that stands out to me, at least based on what we know so far, things can change. This is supposedly, the first part of Biden's proposal. The second part will focus on, the child tax credit, for instance, which he was able to pass through the last relief plan. But there's really no talk of anything permanent, right? Because when you talk about a transformative policy, you're talking about something that fundamentally changes how money is redistributed. And in this case, as far as we know, nothing is really permanent here. It's just, when you say continuation, what I think of is, it's another situation where we're throwing money at something, which is good. That's not to minimize the positive provisions included here, but really, there's nothing that's going to be lasting in terms of, a transformative program, making the child tax credits permanent. He might propose that in the second part of his legislation, but I'm also a little concerned about how this is going to be put out, because is this going to be two different bills? And if that's the case, will there be enough political capital to pass both of them? And I'm worried that by decoupling, the child tax credit and all of those other really important programs, what will end up happening is the infrastructure part might pass because of business interests, but the other provisions that I would like to see passed wouldn't actually make it. I don't know, but we have to see how it's going to be proposed. Is it going to be one robust bill or two separate bills?
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that that so far Biden's approach has been pretty clearly to entertain ideas, from his campaign policy agenda, which was kind of a copy and paste of recent Democratic Party policy world ideas, and he's been talking up those ideas, but then legislatively he's quite ruthlessly pragmatic, and he's willing to jettison anything. He starts at the bottom of the list in terms of how easy it is to pass a given measure, how much support or how little support a measure has, and he just starts chopping things off until he gets to a level of support that he thinks he can get, or that he thinks that can pass the bill. So at the moment, so in other words, early days of the administration, there was a lot of talk about how Biden was going to be passing, there was going to be a massive childcare program, and there was in the infrastructure bill, there was going to be a $15 minimum wage. In the COVID assistance plan, certainly with the minimum wage, it's not just that Biden in the end got rid of it, but he seemed quite prepared to get rid of it without a lot of fuss. He seemed to be kind of expecting that he would end up doing that. So I think that a fair number of these good-sounding policies that are being mooted in the press are probably going to end up being bargaining chips. So that by abandoning one or the other, he can show that he has compromised, and then he can get something passed. Maybe that's something that Joe Manchin needs to see. And he needs a headline that says, the Biden has abandoned this or that liberal policy, and then that gives him permission to vote for it, something like that. Yeah.
I want to ask you about this line that has come out in the wake of the COVID relief package, that it cuts child poverty in half. This was something that the liberal commentators were very excited about. In your analysis of the plan, you mentioned that it does achieve some, it does achieve the reduction in poverty for children, but you point out that it's very similar to the amount that was reduced in the Trump CARES package. Can you explain what's going on with this line? What do the numbers say, and what do you make of this kind of, I guess, selling effort that it cuts child poverty in half?
It was a fantastic marketing move, and it was very clearly. I mean, this is not necessarily a bad thing if you want to pass legislation, or if you just want to advertise that you've passed legislation. That's the sort of thing you would do. But basically, on the day of Biden signing the bill, there was a spate of headlines pointing out. I guess the news hook was there was an analysis that was done by a policy institute at Columbia that found that the bill was going to cut child poverty in half in 2021. So, I mean, what poverty means in policy terms, technically, is the number of people who have an income below some threshold. So because the CARES Act is going to be mailing out a lot of checks to people in 2021 in a single year, there's going to be a fair number of people whose incomes are going to go up above that threshold. And so that represents a reduction in the child poverty rate of apparently about 1/2. But if you scroll back through the archives of the same policy institute, actually, and you look at their analysis that they did of the CARES Act, of Trump's bill a year earlier, they also analyzed it to figure out how many people were going to be lifted above the poverty line, and it was basically about the same percentage point reduction in the number of poor people was going to result from the Trump CARES Act. So I think that it was a selling effort. I mean, the fact that that report came out the day that Biden signed the bill, and that he left on a tour to sort of promote it and hype it, it's an indication that this is what they thought was going to be a successful way of selling the bill, or a successful way of ginning up enthusiasm for it. And it's great to reduce child poverty, even if it is just for a year. But you really got, it was very easy to get a misleading impression from, like the headlines or the tweets or whatever, if you weren't paying close attention, and to think that Biden had just signed a bill that was going to cut child poverty in half, in the sense that, when we talk about war on poverty programs or New Deal programs like Social Security, they had lasting, permanent effects in reducing the rate of elderly poverty in the case of Social Security, or child poverty in the case of some of the Great Society programs. Those were reductions in poverty that weren't just 1 year; they were permanent. And that's the impression that you got from a lot of the headlines with Biden's bill. Now, if you talk to the people who were hyping that stuff, they would say that what makes Biden's bill different, or what makes it justified to talk up that aspect of it, is the fact that there is a proposal that Biden has embraced to make the child tax credit permanent. So in other words, this is supposed to be sort of like an appetizer, and the main course is going to be a bill that's going to come later. That's the main meal, which is making the thing permanent, and that actually would be like a Great Society type program. Now now, I mean, Biden has publicly very firmly embraced the idea of a permanent child tax credit. But since then, he and his team have been going through the numbers and figuring out how this is going to mesh with their infrastructure bill and talking to senators and all the rest of it. And so now you're hearing noises about possibly, for example, having the child benefit be made to continue, but to sunset after 5 years. So that would be right after the next presidential election. So what that means is, if Biden were to lose the election, then that would be the end of the child benefit. On the other hand, you could argue that then is a great motivator at the polls. You can get people to come out to vote for you because you've got this popular policy. But in any case, it's clear from the pattern of Biden's actions, I think, that he has identified the things that have very wide consensus support, and the things that have only the support of the sort of liberals who are the types who have been hyping this like child poverty statistic. And whenever there's any kind of a conflict between the two, he is very ready to get rid of the stuff that only appeals to liberals and to focus on the stuff that has a lot of broad-based support, including from business, Republicans, and so on.
Yeah, and that's something to be concerned about, especially because, there's the child tax credit, which, is popular and should pass. And then there's also, the language coming from the Biden administration in regard to the PRO Act, which has business interests for obvious reasons, panicking about it. And so I came across this exchange on CNBC that I wanted to share with you guys and get your reaction to it, Seth, because it's not just about the PRO Act. It's the tax increases that are proposed as part of this infrastructure bill, in addition to the PRO Act. And just listen to the language here by Douglas Holtz-Eakin, who's from the think tank American Action Forum.
If you look at the composition, if you were to raise the taxes they're raising, the corporate rate, global minimum tax, book income tax, and spend that really, really carefully on core R&D, core infrastructure, you might break even, but I doubt it. If you water it down with the sort of social programs they've got in there, $400 billion expansion of Medicaid, Medicare, and a whole bunch of other things, and then toss in this protecting right to organize PRO Act, which is an extraordinarily anti-growth provision. On balance, this is bad for economic growth, bad for the economy.
Explain that last piece. Why did you say that?
So the PRO Act would preempt right-to-work laws in 27 states. It would change the classification of workers and independent contractors, much like California has with its ABC legislation. It would embrace the joint employer standard that would allow essentially the end of the franchise model in the United States. So it would get rid of the prohibition on secondary boycotts and lead to a lot of very disruption in the flow of goods and services. So there's none of that is about creating jobs or creating greater productivity. So I have real concerns about the economic policy that's in this proposal.
So I wanted to get your reaction to his allegations there, Seth.
Well, I mean, that's, Douglas Holtz-Eakin is sort of like the reality-based economist who works for the Republican Party. There may be one or two other ones. And so it's his job to go on CNBC and badmouth Democratic economic policy generally. I mean, I think it's interesting that even he, there was a piece in the Washington Post the other day by Paul Waldman where he made a point that I thought made a lot of sense, resonated with me, which is that the opposition from the Republicans or Republican world to Biden's infrastructure plan, and also this was the same thing goes for the emergency COVID package. They've been opposing it. Not a single Republican voted for these things or will vote for the infrastructure bill, most likely. And yet there is a notable lack. This is what I was thinking when I saw that clip you just aired. There's a lack of passion and conviction, strangely enough, that is kind of eerie. It's not a lot. It's quite different from what you saw in like the Obama years when the Tea Party was running rampant, and they said all this stuff, but they also seem to really believe it, and they also seem to think that they could get other people to believe it too. And this time, there's a kind of diffidence about the opposition. Holtz-Eakin there was, he was saying, well, if you get rid of a few of these parts of the infrastructure bill, you might be able to pay for, you might be able to get more productivity enough sufficiently to pay for the cost of the investment. But then there's all these other social programs that we don't like. It's not exactly a stirring call to, to insurrection against a socialist tyranny. It's what's remarkable to me so far has been how difficult the Republicans have seemed to find it figuring out how to oppose the stuff that Biden's doing. And I think this is related to what I said a bit earlier, which is that Biden's approach has been to zero in laser-like on those aspects of his agenda that have the least opposition, the most broad-based support, and be willing to sort of trim everything else. And I think that it's to the credit of that strategy that, in part, there's other aspects of there's other factors also, but that's part of the reason why you see Republicans having such a difficult time figuring out how they're going to portray this as the end of civilization as we know it. So if there's one aspect of Biden's administration so far that is a little bit like the New Deal, it's the sense of disarray that you get from the opposition. That's disarray and incoherence. And sort of like a dawning sense of dread, that a realization that of just how unpopular they are, or just how few things they have to offer that are popular. So that's that to me is the thing that resembles it, and that's what I was reminded of when I was listening to Holtz-Eakin.
Can I just quickly jump in on that? Because, sorry, Nando. I just want to make a quick point. I think you're right. And I wonder how much of Trump's success in using, populist framing in campaigning has basically pushed Republicans up against a wall. Like they know that messaging resonated with Republican voters and, working class people. And so, it's really difficult to undo that. Because precisely what you mentioned, I mean, they don't really have any other solutions or anything else to offer people. So it's difficult to come out against something that would improve people's lives. I mean, clearly it doesn't go as far as we'd like, but it would improve people's lives considerably from what they're experiencing right now.
Yeah, and I think that it's important to remember that most people don't pay very close attention to politics, and especially not to the policy side of politics. But what they do, and what they really do notice, however little they pay attention, is when the government sends them a check. And so, Trump sent them a check. I say Trump partly because, that's how he wanted it to be portrayed. He wanted everyone to know that this was not just the government, but it was Donald Trump personally who was sending these checks. Everybody knew that. I mean, even the people who have the least knowledge and the least interest in politics at least know that Donald Trump is a Republican and that Donald Trump sent them this check. So the whole Republican approach to policy, which is basically to say the Democrats are bad because they want to send checks to people for nothing, has really hit the skids. I mean, because you're talking about a contradiction that is visible to almost everybody, not just like a small number of people who pay really close attention to politics. So, I mean, remember the Tea Party, which injected so much energy into the Republican Party, was all about, I don't want, at the beginning especially, it was, I don't want to pay for, my neighbor who took out a mortgage that was too big. I don't want to pay for this. I don't want to pay for that. And how do you get the toothpaste back in the tube after that? I mean, I agree with you. I think that's a real problem for them.
Yeah.
Corey Robin always makes the point that the right or conservatism or whatever you want to call it is most energetic when it's kind of in opposition to sort of some hegemonic alternative. I'm like reminded of like toward the end of the 1970s, like the Carter administration, which was kind of like the end of like the New Deal era in a way, like the liberal response to the conservative movement's energy was, like you said, in the case of the business response to the New Deal, and the Republican response now, just kind of weak or incoherent or kind of cut off guard. And that seems to me like that's the moment that we're entering in now, where the sort of tenets of the right have been so dominant for so long, and they just don't know, they don't have the energy, they've lost the muscle, so to speak. So what kind of phase are we entering? Because it also is not like some left-wing kind of ascendancy that we would like, but what are we entering?
I mean, it's a good question. I think that the fact that it's so difficult to answer, or even really to have a sense of what the possibilities are, is a testament to how fluid the moment is. And I think this is because 4 years of Trump, and then if you want to go deeper than that, not just 4 years of Trump, but also then the Obama years of where McConnell took Republican obstruction to 100%, so that it became sort of the normal processes of government, in a sense, kind of came to a halt, and whatever governing happened was all sort of like emergency measures, or reconciliation, or and then in the end, not very much. All of those things ended up kind of destroying the existing landscape of politics, in the sense of like the norms and the expectations of how things work, and how and what you do in a certain situation. And of course, Trump was the biggest norm destroyer. And then by the end of that whole experience, there's not anything really left of like a familiar landmarks where what the political response to this or that is going to be, or how where you can sort of anticipate how an administration is going to go about pursuing their agenda. It's kind of like a free for all right now, and that, I think, gives Biden a lot of power to shape how things are going to happen over the next few years, because there's a kind of a void of expectations. But I do think that one of the things that I think is at work here in the problems the Republicans have is that you mentioned Corey Robin's thesis about the right being energized by an ascendant left, and from the right point of view, over the last, especially with Trump, for the last 4 years, they have gotten that kind of energy from the perception, or from the depiction of the left as being this cancel culture entity that's trying to evict any kind of conservatism or traditionalism from public life, and that's been the focus of their of the energy they've gotten, in the sense of seeing a threat and responding to the threat. And it was effective for Trump. It got him elected. It got him sort of sustained as something where he had a hardcore fan base. And by getting Trump elected in the White House, it ultimately did allow Republicans to at least get their tax cut. So it sort of kind of worked for all sides, all parties within the Republican side of things in the Republican world. But then there's sort of like a jujitsu thing, that a boomerang that came back on them, which was that the Democrats ended up nominating a guy who is like the least alarming figure from the point of view of somebody who's really afraid of woke culture and cancel culture and all the rest of it, just out of pure affect, and also his record, Biden's record as a moderate. So it's hard to, so that sort of like kills the energy that they used to get from Obama or from AOC or whatever. And meanwhile, Biden is using that room for maneuver to push through what is, in substance, actually probably a much more expansive agenda so far than Obama was pushing. But you can't. It's hard to get the Republican base to get excited about that, because they've been completely distracted by this stuff about this culture war stuff. And the culture war stuff can work, but it doesn't seem to work with Biden in the White House as the face of the enemy. So that, I think, is another aspect of what's making it hard for them to be an effective opposition.
I want to ask very quickly about the PRO Act. After seeing that clip, I did find it kind of, in a way, remarkable that Biden came out and mentioned something about the workers in Bessemer, and then said that that we need to pass the PRO Act and that he would sign it if it came across the desk. I find it notable that he did not say that about Medicare for All. If Medicare for All, he said if it came across his desk for whatever reason, he would veto it. What do you make of that? What's driving it, and how transformative would the PRO Act be or not be?
My sense from listening to people who know a lot about labor policy is that the PRO Act would be transformative, or at least it would be the best. It's the best chance of having a transformative change in the labor law environment for unions of anything that we've seen in a long time. It goes further than the Employee Free Choice Act, which was the sort of the last version of labor's wish list. But I mean, this is part of the kind of the choreography of Democratic Party politics generally. I mean, it's still the case that a Democratic presidential candidate, in order to get elected, has to verbally embrace these kinds of core agenda items for the labor movement. But the catch, of course, and I think, in my opinion, one of the reasons why they have no trouble embracing this stuff is that traditionally there has been this thing called the filibuster that's there that makes it so that they can credibly turn to the unions and say, well, my hands are tied. I can't pass this because I can't get 10 Republican votes in the Senate or whatever. So Joe Biden is a longtime supporter of the filibuster. Obviously, there's a debate right now going on about what the future of the filibuster is going to be. People often talk about the long record of the filibuster's use by segregationists, which is, of course, which is true. It's a big part of the history of the filibuster. But if there's one other policy area that always was one of the bastions of the use of the filibuster, even back in the era when filibusters were pretty uncommon, when they did happen, they happened either over civil rights, or the other one was labor policy. That was the only other thing that was sort of, I guess, by the norms of politics in the 50s, 60s, 70s, was seen as acceptable for to use a filibuster to block, because for obvious reasons, because both civil rights and labor policy, as you alluded to with the PRO Act in this case, labor policy has the potential to have transformative effects on the structure of power in the country. So that's why the filibuster was always seen, even when filibuster was seen as something to be used sparingly. Preventing liberal labor reform was considered one of the acceptable areas for to use the filibuster. So you can see what the effect that's had on the Democratic Party. Democratic presidents have been able to win election promising that they're going to support up and down, right and left, wall to wall, everything that the unions are asking for when it comes to labor policy, knowing that it is inevitable, that there's no way that those things are going to be able to pass unless the Democrats, on the very rare occasions that they do, have at least 60 votes in the Senate, plus control of the House, plus control of the White House. And the interesting thing is that they actually did manage to get that in the first in Obama's first term, and it was like the dog that caught the bus. They had the 60 votes, and then very quickly, at least one Democrat in the Senate who had promised to support the Employee Free Choice Act had to be the one to come out and say, "Oh, sorry, I'm not going to vote for it." And that was, there were a few who were making noises, but it was Blanche Lincoln in the end from Arkansas who ended up playing that role. And so, that's, I think that it's great to talk about the PRO Act and all the good things that it would do. But, in my opinion, it's been pretty dead on arrival from the beginning, or even before arrival.
Yeah, you make a really good point about, legislative process and how the filibuster could and very likely will defeat the PRO Act. But related to that, just to kind of connect the dots in regard to labor power and what's different today versus the lead up to the New Deal, I want to share just a quick snippet of a Smithsonian documentary called America in Color, where they talk about the aftermath of the Great Depression and the type of labor activity that took place as people were getting laid off across the country. This specifically has to do with Ford laying off its workers and the reaction and response from those workers. There's a point to this video, which I'll explain once we come back from it, but let's take a quick look.
But by 1932, sales are at rock bottom, and Ford has lost $75 million. He lays off 2/3 of his workforce. In response, the laid-off workers demand that Ford rehire them. On March 7th, 5,000 gather in Detroit and make their way to the Ford plant in Dearborn. The only surviving footage of that fateful day was filmed by the Detroit Unemployed Council. At the city limits, violence erupts. Dearborn police spray tear gas and attack the men with clubs. The protesters fight back with anything they can. Then Ford's private security gets the nod and opens fire. Four laid-off workers die that day. $80,000 mourners join the funeral procession. The relationship between labor and management will remain contentious.
And it certainly did remain contentious. In fact, that type of activity is what pushed Roosevelt to, move toward the Green New Deal. To pass the New Deal, not the Green New Deal. Sorry about that. But, obviously there's a big difference between what we're experiencing today and noticeably conversations about organizing and labor power are kind of missing from the discussion. All of the focus tends to be on electoral politics. And so, I wanted to get your thoughts on that and how we can, even with the tumultuous situation with the legislative filibuster and how it's going to affect the PRO Act, how can we, have discussions about organizing and increasing labor power and using that as more of a tactic to push the White House to get what we want? Because just relying on electoral politics clearly is not enough.
Well, I think that you're right that the kinds of tactic, or the organizing activity in the workplace with the capital labor, duo in that kind of fight has a structural power to it that that most other forms of activism rarely achieve, just because of the key position that workers are in when it comes to in the workplace, because that's what it's called, is the workplace, and they do the work. So if they decide that they're not going to do it, then everything grinds to a halt, including the flow of profits to business, and a lot of other things stop as well. So the potential there, of course, is enormous, and I think it's most of the stuff that we would like to see happen, at least the more ambitious parts of it, are not going to happen unless and until there's a lot more activity along the lines of what we saw in that video, which is an amazing footage. I'd never seen that stuff before. But in terms of like how you get to that point, I don't think that there's a magic bullet. This is the kind of thing that organizers, this very small number, but very important number of people who day in and day out think about these issues and act on them in their own workplaces as well as within a larger movement, they have been, they talk about and think about this stuff all the time. You can, look at what people around Labor Notes, the organization Labor Notes, which is a sort of a militant, more left-wing organizing tendency within the labor movement. With the stuff that they talk about at their conferences or in their publications, it's really about stuff that's not about mastering knowledge of what's going on in Washington or like reading the New York Times every day. It's about talking to your coworkers. It's about like forming relationships with people immediately around you, so that you have a kind of a network of people who can talk about their grievances and develop a sense of self-confidence that they can challenge the boss and do things that are disruptive and do things that are potentially risky, things that you're not supposed to do. That requires building relationships of trust with other people, and that those are conversations and actions that have to go on at the micro scale, within your workplace, or in your neighborhood or wherever. So I don't have a magic bullet solution to that, but I do agree that those kinds of relationships and leading to that potential kind of contestation, that's the sort of thing really almost exclusively that could lead to the really transformative stuff that we're unlikely to see from a Biden administration.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, with this effort to unionize in Bessemer, what really stood out was how Amazon went out of its way to ensure that its fulfillment center workers don't speak to one another. They would literally put obstacles in place to prevent them from gathering together, having conversations about the workplace. And so that tells you everything you need to know about what, corporate interests look to do just to further atomize people and prevent any type of collective action. So go ahead, Nando.
No, I mean, I think that's all right. I mean, I think maybe to wrap it up, I wanted to ask about the Biden framing of the infrastructure bill. One of the selling points, one of the marketing points for it is that we need this if we're going to compete with those dastardly Chinese. What did you make of that?
Well, I mean, that's probably an effective line to use on some people, on some senators maybe, and I think senators are probably the main intended audience for that kind of rhetoric. But I mean, not because Biden is uninterested in dealing firmly with the Chinese, but I'm skeptical of the extent to which he actually thinks that the stuff in the infrastructure bill is going to play an important part in that. I mean, they may end up stuffing it full of other things that we haven't heard about that are more geared towards like national security considerations. But it is an indication that of a climate that's developing now. It's familiar from the back in the first Cold War days, because back then you also heard that kind of rhetoric from politicians whenever they wanted you to support something that they were peddling. They would say, this is good because it'll help us in the Cold War against the Soviets. And if you're starting to hear that kind of rhetoric about things like the infrastructure bill, and you're hearing it even from Joe Biden and not from, let's say, the most notorious neocon type hawks like Marco Rubio or something, it's an indication of how far along this Cold War mentality has gotten. I mean, what's interesting is that if you look at I mean, this is really a Trump era phenomenon that has become permanent. And when Trump was running for president, the members of the people in the establishment who were horrified by what he was saying and by the prospect of him winning the election would say he's terrible because he's a nationalist who is going to rip up the whole rules-based order that has created this Pacific globalization that we're all benefiting from. Through his nasty rhetoric about China and his threats of tariffs on China. And then the interesting thing was that as soon as Trump actually started doing that stuff, it turned out that the whole business world and much of the kind of establishment foreign policy world, behind their earlier rhetoric of, we should try to keep China in this, within the tent of the international system, engagement and all the rest of it. But behind that rhetoric, they had, I think, for a long time, been sort of, in a sense, kind of waiting for an opportunity to move towards a Cold War posture. And it was, of all people, Donald Trump, the guy who they claimed was, a disaster who doesn't know anything about foreign policy, who gave them the permission structure to shift to an actual anti-China Cold War type position, which is what happened. So that by the end of the Trump administration, you have Joe Biden and much of both parties using rhetoric that 4 years ago was considered to be the rhetoric of Donald Trump.
Yeah, it is pretty incredible. Absolutely. And those campaign ads, I mean, it didn't matter if it was a Trump campaign ad on China or a Biden campaign ad on China. They were very similar in messaging. So you're right about that. Seth, thank you so much for joining us. Everyone go check out Seth's work. He's the executive editor over at Jacobin. And we really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.